On the 14th of April 1945, an order was given by the head of the SS that sealed the executions and deaths of dozens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners as the Second World War was coming to an end in Europe. Heinrich Himmler ordered all the concentration camps to be evacuated and stated that not a single prisoner must fall alive into the enemy's hands. With this, thousands of people were evacuated out of the camps, and some of them were marched into nearby oceans and seas and were executed by machine gunners who stood on the beaches. There were death marches also ordered, and on these anyone who could not keep up was shot, and mindless killing continued as the noose tightened around the remaining part of Hitler's government and his grip on the conflict faltered. But one of the largest sites which was evacuated was Flossenburg concentration camp, which was found in a remote mountain region of Bavaria, close to the Nazi heartlands, where the shoots of Hitler's party emerged. Around 90,000 prisoners passed through the gates of the camp, and roughly 30,000 died, becoming victims of execution, overwork, poor conditions, and a lack of food and water. Welcome to the Untold Past. Join us today as we look at the execution of the prisoners of Flossenburg, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Flossenburg concentration camp opened in May 1938, and it was a site developed to meet the needs of the SS, who were rounding up thousands of enemies of the Third Reich. The SS wanted to put these people into slave labour, quarrying granite, and this was needed for the Nazi building projects, and they wanted to make as much money from these, people's exploitation, as they could. SS officers Theodor Eicke and Oswald Perl found a site near to the small town of Flossenburg, where a camp would be created, and it was in a poor rural area. There were to begin with 8 barracks and 100 prisoners from Dachau who arrived to construct the camp, and further prisoners from other sites came to work. Himmler later visited Flossenburg on the 16th of May 1938, and the inmates had built the whole infrastructure from scratch, including erecting the barbed wire fence which would keep them in. Over time, the site's population increased to 1,500 after prisoners from Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald also arrived, and more were pushed into the quarrying work. After the barracks were completed, prison blocks and watchtowers were made, and further expansion occurred. As the war years continued, there were thousands of prisoners sent to the camp, and this included Soviet prisoners of war who had been captured following the launching of Operation Barbarossa. Many were so poorly treated at the site that they had to spend some time recovering from their injuries. Within a year, the population of Flossenburg went from 4,000 in 1943 to over 40,000 in 1944. Many of the guards were also sent from the site to fight for Hitler's crumbling empire as the war turned against them, and 500 female SS guards were brought in to work alongside older men and wounded members of the German army. As well as working in the quarries, there were a number of aircraft and armaments factories set up inside of Flossenburg, and these prisoners were ordered and were forced to make parts which would be used by the German army. Flossenburg in particular was a site with a high armaments output, and the conditions of the camp were truly awful. Only roughly 10% of the deaths occurred inside the camp before 1943, but then as the war went wrong for the Germans, the slaughter inside of the camp ramped up. More demand inside of the factories led to more accidents and more cases of prisoners being worked to death. They were incredibly dehydrated and suffered from a lack of water, and it was also very cold and wet a lot of the time as they were in the mountains. The inmates were not given appropriate clothing for this, and despite the site seeing huge numbers of prisoners being sent there, the barrack buildings and space were not sufficient. It was a camp which was nowhere fit enough for the amount of prisoners who were sent there. The Karpos, those prisoners who were given some power by the SS, were also known for their brutality and evil, and many battered and brutalised inmates on a daily basis. Many Karpos were said to have been corrupt and in league with the SS. One camp elder and Karpo was at the end of the war beaten to death by the inmates after the site was liberated, and much of the Karpos had abused younger inmates and also beaten prisoners to death who could not complete work enough as they were tired, broken and struggling. There were accounts of inmates being shot and executed by guards after escape attempts, and some being subjected to cold water torture, being covered in freezing water and then left outside. One of the biggest tortures at Flossenburg was the lack of food and supplies that the inmates were given. The inmates had hardly any food, and also disease spread around the camp quickly. One bout of dysentery which caused chaos even forced the camp to be shut down, and typhus epidemics in 1944 and early 1945 caused thousands of deaths. It's believed also that around 75% of the deaths at the camp took place 9 months before Flossenburg was liberated, showing the desperate conditions in the final months of the war. But inside of the camp there was a huge amount of execution also carried out. The SS, because of the rising death rate, ordered that a crematoria inside the camp should be made, and this facility dealt with the bodies, burning them inside of the ovens. But there was also a lot of execution using firing squad and shooting that occurred. These executions began in February 1941, and Polish political prisoners were taken to a firing range and were shot against the wall of this. Usually victims outlined for execution were separated following evening roll call, and they were then told of their fate, before they were shot in the firing range next to the crematoria shortly after. There were mass executions carried out here, and later lethal injections were used to condemn them. This was brutally changed following harrowing reports from locals in the nearby area that blood and body parts from the executions were finding their ways into streams and polluting water sources. There were many executed in this manner, including Soviet prisoners of war, but also many doctors who were involved in the Action T4 program selected suffering inmates and ill prisoners to be sent to sites of slaughter nearby. Others were sent from the camp to Auschwitz and Majdanek, where they were killed as soon as they got off the trains, as they were driven into the gas chambers. Executions in their numbers increased at the end of the war too, as those who were suspected of trying to escape or who were accused of getting involved in resistance activities were also condemned. There was also a number of high-profile executions carried out, including 13 Allied spies and a number of German officials and senior members of the church. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was executed in the camp on the 9th of April 1945, and he was the chief of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, for almost 10 years. He was a supporter of Hitler to begin with, but he then turned against him and was involved in resistance under cover against the Nazis. This came to light and he was arrested, and after lengthy investigations he was sent to Flossenburg, where he was then led to the gallows naked. This was an act of disgrace, and was seen as pure humiliation by Hitler and the Nazis, and he was hanged on a butcher's hook, which was a medieval style of execution. He may have been subjected to a longer execution, being cut down before he succumbed to his death repeatedly. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a prominent member of the Confessing Church, and he was known for his resistance to the Nazi regime, and he spoke out against a number of Hitler's policies. He was later arrested by the Gestapo and imprisoned for 18 months, and he was sent to Flossenburg. On the very same day as Canaris, Bonhoeffer was also executed. One witness to his death said, "At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer and then climbed the few steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued after a few seconds. In the almost 50 years that I worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God." It was later claimed by another prisoner that Bonhoeffer was executed over a lengthy 6-hour period, as he was hanged and revived, and his agony prolonged. But more terror would take place inside of Flossenburg, as the death marches were ordered from the camp. Early in the morning of the 16th of April 1945, 1,700 prisoners left the camp, and they were guarded by many SS men. They walked to the railway station, and were loaded onto a train, but this train was then strafed by American aircraft, and many prisoners died. Those who managed to escape were rounded up, and were executed by SS guards. Further death marches took place, and others were also strafed. It was said by one prisoner that the SS men joked and laughed during the shooting. The prisoners were led into groups of 15 and 20. They had to lie on the ground and were shot in the nape. Prisoners had to march through terrible conditions, and if someone could not keep up, they were immediately shot. Further evacuations sent inmates to other camps and towns, but as the final days of the war came, a number of SS guards tried to flee to save their skin, and the prisoners were abandoned. The American army found 2,500 prisoners at Flossenburg in the main camp, but later further execution was discovered in the subcamps. The SS had slaughtered the sick prisoners before leaving. There were war crimes trials held to deal with those guards of Flossenburg, and some death sentences were handed out, as well as lengthy prison sentences. But most of these jail terms were not served out, as within a number of years the former guards were paroled and were released. Inside of Flossenburg, the liberators found a site which had been a camp of incredible hard labour, and they even found the execution range next to the crematoria, with the bullet holes still in the walls showing what happened there. Around 30,000 people during its time in operation were executed, killed or slaughtered by the conditions or the SS guards. It was a truly terrifying Second World War concentration camp, and was somewhere that has gone down in history as one of the most barbaric sites of the deadliest world conflict in history. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.